The morning Emma Alden stepped off the train in Harlan County, Texas, in the spring of 1882, a man standing beside a water trough spat tobacco juice onto the dust and said, loud enough for her to hear, that the land out here ate women like her for breakfast. She picked up her carpetbag, straightened the brim of her traveling hat, and walked right past him without a single word, because she had not ridden 3 days and 2 nights from Cincinnati, Ohio, with nothing but a deed folded inside her corset, and a stubborn kind of hope lodged behind her sternum, to be rattled by a man with tobacco on his chin. The deed had belonged to her father, Thomas Alden, who had spent the last 12 years of his life writing letters about a parcel of Texas grassland he intended to build into something worthy of the Alden name. He had died of a fever the previous October without ever seeing it, and Emma, 24 years old, unmarried, and possessed of considerably more determination than the people of Cincinnati gave her credit for, had packed everything she owned and come to claim it herself. The land office in the town of Harlan was a narrow building wedged between a general store and a saloon, and the clerk behind the counter was a wiry, red-faced man named Corbin who looked at Emma's deed the way a man looks at something he suspects is counterfeit. "You're Thomas Alden's heir," he said, and the question carried a distinct note of disappointment. "I am his daughter and his only living relative," Emma said. "The deed is properly notarized and witnessed, Mr. Corbin. I trust you'll find everything in order." He studied it another long moment, then pushed it back across the counter with a reluctant stamp. "The Alden parcel is northeast, about 6 miles out along Dry Creek Road," he said. "There are 2 things you ought to know, Miss Alden. First, the land hasn't been worked in years and the soil is hardpan in places. Second, your nearest neighbor is Noah Ramsey, and Noah Ramsey does not like neighbors." Emma folded the deed carefully and tucked it into her bag. "Then I suppose he and I will have a great deal to discuss," she said, and walked out into the blinding Texas sun. She hired a wagon and a driver from the livery for 50 cents, and for 6 miles she watched the landscape shift from the scrubby outskirts of town into something wider and more honest. The grassland rolled out in long, pale gold waves under a sky so enormous it made her feel like she was being watched by God himself. Mesquite trees dotted the ridgelines. A hawk turned slow circles above a dry creek bed. It was nothing like Ohio, and it was nothing like what she had imagined, and she loved it immediately with a fierce and inexplicable certainty. The Alden parcel announced itself through its neglect. The fence lines were slumped and scattered, the posts rotted at their bases. The house, a 2-room structure built from rough-cut cedar, had a roof that sagged visibly on the eastern corner, and a front door hanging crooked on one hinge. The driver set her bag in the dust, tipped his hat with something very close to pity, and drove back toward town. Emma stood in front of the house for a long moment. She pressed her lips together. She went inside. The floor was solid. The walls were thick. The fireplace drew well enough, as she discovered when she cleared out a bird's nest and lit a small fire from wood stacked beside the back wall. There was a rope bed frame in the back room, no mattress, but she had brought a bedroll. There was a well out back that, when she dropped a bucket down, came back up with good clear water. She stood in the fading afternoon light, cataloging what she had and what she needed, and she felt something settle in her chest like the last piece of a long puzzle finding its place. She was going to make this work. The first indication of Noah Ramsey came the following morning, when she walked out to assess the fence line on the eastern boundary of her property, and found a man already standing there looking at her. He was tall, somewhere in his early 30s, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who work outdoors for a living, rather than men who simply grow that way. He wore a battered dark hat pulled low, a work shirt faded to the color of an old sky, and leather chaps over dark trousers. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same hardpan Corbin had warned her about, and dark eyes that assessed her with the frank, unhurried attention of a man used to reading conditions at a distance. He did not look unfriendly, precisely. He looked like a man who kept everything very carefully in order, and who could already see that Emma Alden was about to complicate that order considerably. "You're the Alden heir," he said. It was not a question. "Emma Alden," she said, and put out her hand. He looked at it for a fraction of a second, then shook it. His grip was firm and brief. "Noah Ramsey. Your fence line runs to that cedar post with the notch on the top. Everything east of that is Ramsey land." "I can see the post," Emma said pleasantly, "and I have a survey map in the house that agrees with you, so we're off to a fine start." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, the near vicinity of one. "You plan to work this land yourself," he said. "I do," she said. He looked out across the neglected parcel behind her, taking in the slumped fences, the dry, weedy ground, the house with its unhappy roof. "It's hardpan in the southern third," he said after a moment. "Your father's land hasn't seen a plow in 4 years." "I know," she said. "I'll start with the northern section." "You'll need a team," he said. "I'll get one." "It'll cost you," he said. "Most things do," she said. He studied her for another long, quiet moment, and she had the distinct sense that he was making a calculation she wasn't fully privy to. "I'll tell you plainly, Miss Alden," he said. "I've watched 4 families try to work parcels in this county and fail. The land out here doesn't accommodate inexperience or wishful thinking. I'd hate to see a woman alone out here come to grief over a bad harvest and a leaking roof." Emma looked at him steadily. She had heard the same sentiment from her mother's sisters in Cincinnati, from the banker who had looked at the deed, from 2 men on the train, and from the tobacco-spitting man at the station. She was not angry at Noah Ramsey for saying it. He said it with a kind of blunt honesty that was different from the dismissal she had encountered elsewhere. But she was not about to agree with it either. "Then I suppose you'll have the unusual experience of watching a woman not come to grief," she said. "Good morning, Mr. Ramsey." She turned and walked back toward her house, and she did not look behind her, though she was quite certain he stood there watching for a good while longer. In the days that followed, Emma worked from first light to last. She hired a man from town named Hector Vega, a compact and capable Mexican man in his late 40s whose English was excellent and whose knowledge of Texas soil was encyclopedic, to help her plow the northern section. She bought a team of 2 workhorses, bay mares she named Clover and June, at the Harlan livestock auction for $42, which was more than she had hoped to spend but less than she had feared. She renegotiated the roof on her house with a carpenter named Abe who charged her $5 and a promised bushel of whatever she grew, a deal she shook on without hesitation. She planted wheat in the northern field and a kitchen garden near the house, and she mended fences on the weekends with wire she bought from the general store and posts she cut herself from the mesquite along the creek bed. Her hands bled and then hardened. Her shoulders ached constantly for the first 3 weeks and then stopped complaining. She learned what hardpan felt like under a plow blade, and she learned that the southern third of her land, which everyone had written off, had a shallow clay layer about 8 inches down that might, if she could get water to it, actually hold moisture through the dry season. She wrote this theory in a letter to a professor of agronomy she had corresponded with once through her father's papers, a man at a college in Missouri, and waited to see what he wrote back. Meanwhile, she saw Noah Ramsey again. He came by the 2nd week, not with any announced purpose, but she noticed his horse at the edge of the fence line while she was working in the north field with Hector and the team. He sat there for a while, watching, in the way that might have been surveillance or might have been something else entirely, and then he rode away without speaking. She told herself she was not thinking about it. The 3rd week he came to the fence line again, and this time she walked over. "Good afternoon," she said. "Miss Alden." He looked at the plowed field behind her with what seemed like genuine evaluation rather than skepticism. "You got that whole north section turned." "We did," she said. "Hector knows what he's doing." "Vega's a good man," Noah said with the tone of someone issuing a small, deliberate endorsement. "What are you planting?" "Wheat," she said. "And I want to talk to you about the southern section." He raised an eyebrow just barely. "The hardpan." "I think there's clay under it," she said. "If I could divert a portion of the creek flow during the spring season, even a shallow irrigation channel, it might become workable." He was quiet for a long moment. "Dry Creek doesn't run hard enough to divert in summer," he said. "No, but it runs in spring," she said. "I've walked it twice this week." He looked at her, and there was something different in his expression now. The near vicinity of a smile thing had shifted into something more curious and more genuine, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she noticed the quality of his eyes more clearly at close range than she had expected to. They were dark brown, very direct, and when he was thinking seriously about something, there was a steadiness in them that was oddly settling. "You've been walking the creek," he said. "Every morning before breakfast," she said. He took his hat off, turned it in his hands once, and put it back on. "I'll show you where the creek bends east behind my northern pasture," he said. "There's a natural depression there that your father talked to me about once, a long time ago. I always thought he was right about it, but he never got the chance to act on it." Emma felt something catch in her throat at the mention of her father. She had not expected it, not from this man, not in this context, and she steadied herself before speaking. "He told you about it." "He wrote me a letter maybe 3 years ago," Noah said. "We were neighbors on paper before we were neighbors in person. He had ideas for this land. He was a thoughtful man." "He was," Emma said quietly. They stood in silence for a moment that was not uncomfortable, just waited, and Emma was grateful for it. "I'll ride out tomorrow morning if you want to come see the bend in the creek," Noah said, returning to practicality with the ease of a man who knew when sentiment needed to be handled carefully and set aside. 7 o'clock. "I'll be there," she said. She was there at 5 minutes to 7, which meant she was already at the fence line when he arrived at 7, and he noticed that she was early with a glance that said nothing but communicated something. He was riding a gray horse, a handsome and serious animal, and he had a rolled map tucked into his saddlebag, which turned out to be an old survey map of the area with notations he had made himself over years of working and learning the land. They rode along the fence line to the north, and then he opened the gate at the corner of his pasture, and they rode together across Ramsey land toward the creek bend. Emma noticed how different his land felt from hers, how established and tended, the grass thick and properly grazed, the fence post straight, a windmill turning in the distance above a tank that would water cattle through the summer. He had built something real here, and she could see in the shape and order of it that it had not happened easily or quickly, but through exactly the kind of sustained, deliberate effort that she intended to apply to her own parcel. The creek bend was exactly what he had described. A low natural depression, sheltered by a stand of cottonwood trees, where the water pooled and slowed before turning east across the corner of his property. If she dug a shallow channel north from there, running along the property line, she could pull spring water south across the clay layer of her southern field. It would take 2 weeks of digging, she said, thinking out loud while she walked the line of it. 3 men could do it in that time, Noah said. "I have Hector," she said. "I have 2 hands I could spare for a week," he said, and it came out levelly and without ceremony, in the manner of a man offering a practical solution to a practical problem, and Emma turned to look at him. "Why?" she said. She did not mean it as suspicion. She meant it as a genuine question, because she was a woman who preferred to understand the motivations of people helping her. Noah was quiet for a moment, looking at the creek. "Because your father had the right idea about this land," he said, "and because watching it go to waste another year would bother me more than the cost of a week's labor." It was not a romantic answer. It was an honest one. And Emma, who had grown up in a world where people dressed their true reasons in all manner of social clothing, found it refreshing to the point of almost startling. "Then thank you," she said. "I accept." The digging took 9 days. Noah sent 2 of his hands, young men named Pete and Dell, capable and hardworking, and she and Hector worked alongside them. Noah himself came on the 4th day and stayed through the 7th, working with his coat off and his sleeves rolled to the elbows in the channel mud. And Emma noticed, in the entirely practical way that one notices things that are simply and factually present, that he was stronger than he looked at first assessment, and that he worked with a concentrated efficiency that she found herself matching, as if trying to prove something she had not consciously decided to prove. On the fifth evening, when the light was going copper and the creek water was beginning to trickle into the new channel with a sound like something beginning, they sat on the bank eating the cold biscuits and dried beef that Emma had brought out for the crew, and the others had drifted a little way off, and she and Noah sat within a comfortable distance of each other watching the water find its new path. "How long have you been in Harlan County?" she asked. 11 years, he said. "I came out from Tennessee at 22 with 2 horses and a borrowed stake, and the understanding that I was going to build something or die doing it. Your family was in Tennessee." "My parents and my brother," he said. "My mother passed a few years back. My brother came out here 5 years ago and works with me now, James. He's over at the South Pasture this week, or you'd have met him already." "You never married," she said, and then wondered if she was being too forward, but he answered without any sign of minding. "No," he said. "There's a shortage of patience among women for men who put the land first and everything else in a far second place." "I don't think that's entirely true," Emma said carefully. "I think some women might understand that very well." He turned to look at her then, and the quality of that look was different from anything she had yet seen from him, something more tentative and more serious at once. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at the creek, because she was not yet sure what she was feeling, and she had a policy of not acting before she was sure. "How long are you planning to stay?" he asked after a while. "As long as the land lets me," she said, "which I intend to be a very long time." "Most people who come out here say that," he said, not unkindly. "I know," she said. "I intend to mean it." The wheat went in during the last days of April, and by late May it was showing green along the top of the north field in rows that filled Emma with a deep and almost embarrassing pride every morning when she walked out to check on it. The irrigation channel was running well, feeding the southern field with enough spring water that the clay layer had softened, and was now showing the early response of soil being reintroduced to moisture after a long, dry period. She sent her letter off to the agronomy professor, a man named Dr. Whitfield, and received in return a detailed and enthusiastic letter back with suggestions for what crop might best break the hardpan and build organic matter in the clay soil. He recommended sorghum for the first season, explaining that its deep roots would penetrate and break up the compacted layer in a way that would leave the ground significantly more workable for a cereal crop the following year. He also mentioned, in a postscript that Emma read 3 times, that a woman achieving viable production from a clay-underlaid hardpan parcel in Texas, using spring irrigation, was not something he had encountered in his career, and that he would be very interested to hear her results. She showed this letter to Hector, who read it twice and then said that the professor was probably right about the sorghum, and that he had a cousin who had grown it on similar land in South Texas. She did not show it to Noah Ramsey, but she mentioned it the next time she saw him at the fence line, which was becoming a place they met with a regularity that neither of them had formally arranged, but both seemed to be engineering in the casual, sideways way of people who are not yet willing to call a habit what it is. "Sorghum," he said, considering this. "In the South Field. For the first season," she said, "to break up the clay layer and build the soil." He nodded slowly. "That's not a bad idea," he said, and coming from Noah Ramsey, whom she had now come to understand was constitutionally opposed to hyperbole of any kind, this was a substantial endorsement. "I'll need to buy the seed," she said. "I'm running thin on cash until the wheat comes in. There's a grain merchant in Abilene who deals in sorghum seed at better prices than Harlan," Noah said. "I'm driving over there in 2 weeks for supplies, if you wanted to make a list." "I'd be grateful," she said. She made the list. He came back from Abilene with the seed, and with, as a small unremarked gesture that she was not supposed to make too much of, a book he had seen in a dry goods store there, a volume on soil management and crop rotation that he said he thought she might find useful. He handed it to her over the fence with the focused neutrality of a man leaving a tool rather than giving a gift, and she accepted it in the same tone, and they both pretended this was simply a practical transaction, and neither of them was entirely convincing. She read the book twice through in 2 weeks. She took notes in the margins in pencil. She left it on the kitchen table where she could see it. June arrived with heat that she had not been fully prepared for, a dry and pressing wait that began around 9 in the morning and did not relent until well after sundown. Emma bought a broader-brimmed hat from the general store, the kind with a proper crown, and she soaked it in the water bucket before she put it on each morning because Hector had told her this was the most effective way to keep cool, and she had found he was right about most things. The wheat was coming on well. The sorghum was planted and showing its first leaves in the southern field. The irrigation channel was holding, and she had reinforced 2 sections of it where the banks had begun to crumble. The house roof was no longer sagging, thanks to Abe's work, and she had replaced the broken front door hinge herself using a set of tools her father had left in the shed that she had cleaned and oiled into working condition. She was, by any reasonable measure, doing exactly what she had come here to do. And she was also, by a less measurable but equally compelling standard, finding herself thinking more than was strictly necessary about a tall man with a carved jaw and very direct dark eyes, who handed her books over fences and showed her where creeks bent, and mentioned her father with quiet, genuine respect. The town of Harlan held a summer social in the first week of July, an annual tradition that the minister's wife organized with formidable efficiency, featuring a potluck supper in the churchyard, music from a fiddle and guitar duo, and the kind of general gathering that in a small community served both as celebration and as the social maintenance of relationships that made isolated life bearable. Emma went because Hector's wife, a warm and direct woman named Rosa who had befriended Emma with the frank affection of someone who has identified a kindred spirit, insisted on it, and showed up at her house that afternoon to make sure she actually got ready and came. Emma wore her one good dress, a dark blue cotton with white at the collar that she had brought from Cincinnati hoping to have occasion to wear it. Rosa approved of it with the efficiency of a woman who had already decided her friend looked fine and was not inclined to belabor the point. They drove together in Rosa's wagon, and Emma felt, arriving in the churchyard with the smell of cooking and the sound of the fiddle already in the warm evening air, something very close to the first full ease she had experienced since arriving in Harlan. She ate and talked and met people she had not yet encountered, a schoolteacher named Miss Price who was thin and sharp-eyed and very funny, a blacksmith named Sam Hollies who had opinions about cattle that he expressed at considerable length, the minister and his formidable wife, and several families who farmed the land around Harlan with varying degrees of prosperity and optimism. Noah Ramsey arrived around 7:30, accompanied by a younger man who shared enough of his build and his coloring to be clearly identified as the brother James, who turned out to be 27, somewhat more inclined to smiling than Noah, and possessed of a sincere and uncomplicated friendliness that Emma liked immediately. James shook her hand and said he had heard a good deal about the irrigation channel project and thought it was a fine piece of work, and Emma noticed Noah standing just behind his brother's shoulder with a focused attention to something across the yard that she suspected was not as interesting to him as he was pretending. She was talking to Miss Price about educational materials and the challenges of teaching in a frontier town when Noah came to stand beside her with a plate of food and the easy positioning of a man who had navigated himself to a location without making a formal declaration of intent. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening," she said, and Miss Price, who was perceptive in the manner of schoolteachers who spend their days reading rooms full of people, excused herself with a small smile. "Your wheat is looking well," Noah said. "I walked it this morning," Emma said. 3 more weeks, I think, before it's ready." "I'd say 2.5," he said, "but you know your field better than I do." This was not the kind of thing Noah Ramsey typically said, the qualifier that gave the other person credit over his own assessment, and Emma noticed it the way you notice a change in the wind. The fiddle player struck up a waltz, and around them the yard began the gentle shuffle of couples finding each other. "Do you dance, Mr. Ramsey?" Emma asked, surprising herself. He looked at her with a quality of attention that was not alarm but was certainly something, a focusing of presence that she could feel even standing 2 feet from him. "I have been known to," he said. "Then I'm asking you to," she said. He set his plate down on the nearest table and offered his hand with the particular gravity of a man who does not do things carelessly. She took it, and they moved onto the grass where others were dancing, and his hand on her waist was careful and steady, and she was aware of the warmth of it through the fabric of her dress with a clarity that had nothing to do with the summer heat. He danced well, not with showiness but with the same kind of efficient competence he brought to everything, and they moved together without talking for the first full turn of the waltz, and Emma found that the silence between them had the quality she had come to associate specifically with him, that rare kind of quiet that does not need filling because something is already being communicated within it. "You surprise me," he said, finally. "I've been told I do that," she said. "I don't mean it as a criticism," he said. "I didn't take it as one," she said. He looked down at her, and in the lantern light strung through the churchyard trees, his face had a different quality than it did in the plain daylight of fence lines and creek banks. There was something there that she identified slowly and carefully as something he was not quite sure what to do with, and she understood it because she was experiencing a version of the same thing. "You're the most capable person I've met in some time," he said, and it came out with a plainness that made it more than a compliment. It was a statement of fact from a man who dealt in facts, and it landed accordingly. "You're not bad yourself," she said lightly, because she was not yet willing to have this conversation be as serious as it wanted to become, not in the middle of a churchyard social, not with the fiddle sawing away and James Ramsey watching from the supper table with no pretense of looking elsewhere. Noah almost smiled. The full real version of it, which she had not yet seen and which, she now saw, altered his face in a way that she was quite sure would be difficult to stop thinking about. The wheat harvest came in during the 3rd week of July, and it was good. Not extraordinary, not the kind of harvest that rewarded years of preparation, but genuinely solid, a proper first-year yield from land that had been neglected for 4 years. Emma stood in the cut field with Hector on the last afternoon of the harvest, watching the light go long and golden over the stubble, and felt the kind of satisfaction that lives in the bones rather than the mind. She paid Hector his wages, and an additional $1 she could not strictly spare because he had earned it. He took it without false protest, the way a man with dignity accepts what is owed to him, and told her the South Field sorghum was looking promising and that she should be proud of what she had built this season. "My father would have been pleased," she said. "I think he would have been amazed," Hector said, and he said it with a small smile that made her laugh. She sold her wheat at the grain elevator in Harlan at fair market price, which in 1882 was good enough to cover her operating costs for the year and leave her with a working surplus for the next season. She was not wealthy. She was not even comfortable by any Ohio standard of the word. But she was solvent and she was operational and she owned a piece of land that was becoming something, and these facts felt, to Emma Alden, like considerable wealth of a more durable kind. Noah heard about the harvest before she told him, in the way that news travels in small communities through a dozen casual exchanges, and when she saw him at the fence line the morning after the harvest was done he said, "Good yield." "Yes," she said. "Better than I expected for a first season," he said. "Better than you expected when," she said, "when I first arrived or now," he paused. "When you first arrived," he said. "I've been revising expectations for some time." She looked at him. "I noticed," she said, and something shifted between them, acknowledged for the first time without either of them backing away from it. "I'd like to take you to supper in Harlan on Saturday," he said, and it came out with the careful precision of a man who had decided to say a thing and was saying it before he could reconsider. Not as neighbors discussing land matters, as something else. Emma looked at him for a moment, at the fence post between them and the wide Texas sky above, and the gravity of his expression, and the way his hands were very still at his sides in the manner of a man exercising control over the fact that they would rather be doing something else. "Yes," she said. "I would like that." Saturday arrived with the particular quality of importance that days sometimes carry when something is going to change. Emma wore the dark blue dress again and pinned her hair up properly and walked into the small hotel dining room in Harlan, where Noah was already waiting at a table by the window, wearing a clean dark coat and a look of focused composure that she recognized as his version of nervous. The supper lasted 3 hours. They talked about Tennessee and Ohio, about what it meant to build something with your hands in a place that was not yet decided whether it wanted to help you or not, about Emma's father and what he had believed about this land, about Noah's mother and what she had taught him about work and patience, and the kind of pride that is earned rather than assumed. They talked about books, which surprised them both, discovering that they had both read extensively and that their tastes overlapped in ways that felt significant. Emma had read extensively in science and natural history. Noah had a collection of history and philosophy books that lined the walls of his front room, which Emma had not seen but could now clearly imagine. He walked her home in the warm dark after supper, along the road that connected the town to the land they both worked, and the stars above the Texas plain were extraordinary in the way that they can only be in a place where there is no competing light. And Emma felt so entirely present in the specific texture of the moment that she could have described it 20 years later in exact detail. At her front gate he stopped, and she stopped beside him, and he turned to her with the careful deliberateness that characterized everything he did. "I want to say something," he said. "Then say it," she said. "I told Corbin at the land office, when I heard a woman was coming to work the Alden parcel, that the land would break her," he said. "I want you to know that I said it and I was wrong, and I am not a man who admits being wrong easily or often, which is a fault I am working on." Emma looked at him in the starlight and felt something so warm and large in her chest that she was not entirely sure what to do with it. "You told Corbin that," she said. "I did," he said. "And I'd like to think that the man who said it and the man standing here are not entirely the same man, because you have a way of making people revise their thinking." "Noah," she said. "Yes," he said. "You can stop making speeches," she said. And she stepped forward and kissed him because she was a woman who knew what she wanted and had learned that waiting for permission was a different thing from waiting for the right moment, and this was clearly the right moment. He was still for exactly one surprised second, and then his hands came up and held her face with a gentleness that was completely at odds with the size and the calluses of them. And the kiss was warm and unhurried and spoke of something neither of them had said aloud yet, but both of them knew was already true. When they stepped back from each other, the Texas night was as enormous and indifferent and beautiful as it had always been, and they were both smiling, which for Noah Ramsey was a visible event worth noting. "Good night, Mr. Ramsey," Emma said. "Good night, Miss Alden," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice even as she walked up to her front door, and she carried it inside with her like a lamp. Autumn came to Harlan County with a long golden slowdown, the heat releasing its grip incrementally, the mornings going crisp and the evenings cool in a way that felt like the land exhaling. Emma harvested her sorghum in September, and it had done exactly what Dr. Whitfield's letter had predicted. The deep roots had penetrated the clay layer, aerating and breaking the compacted hardpan in a way that would make the following season's plowing significantly easier. She wrote to Dr. Whitfield with a full account of her results, including soil observations and yield measurements, and received back an enthusiastic reply in which he said her data was genuinely valuable, and that he intended to reference her case in a paper He was preparing on land reclamation practices in the Texas grasslands. He addressed the letter to E. Alden, and she did not correct his assumption that E stood for Edward. The relationship between Emma and Noah developed with the same quality as everything else about them: direct, practical, and anchored in deep substance rather than performance. He took her to supper in Harlan twice more in October, and she had him to her house for supper twice, cooking on her cast-iron stove with the methodical competence she brought to all tasks, and he sat at her kitchen table in the lamplight and looked around at the books and notes and maps and the general organized intelligence of her working life, and said on the second occasion that he had never met anyone who made him think so hard in so many different directions at once. "Is that a complaint?" She said. "No," he said. "It's closer to what I imagine drowning feels like, but entirely voluntary and not unpleasant." She laughed, full and genuine, and he watched her laugh with an expression so openly warm that James, who had made the mistake of stopping by to return a borrowed tool and had witnessed this exchange from the doorway, backed out quietly and rode home in considerable personal satisfaction. James Ramsey had, by November, become a good friend to Emma in his own right, someone she traded honest conversation and occasional agricultural advice with, and whose opinion she valued. He was engaged to a young woman from a farm east of town named Caroline, a marriage planned for the following spring, and Emma liked Caroline immediately when she met her, a capable and good-humored woman who brought a lightness to the Ramsey household that it clearly benefited from. "My brother looks different," James told Emma one afternoon in November, leaning against her fence post in the comfortable manner of someone who has stopped pretending to have an errand. "He's looked like a man with a problem he can't solve for about 4 years now, and lately he looks like a man who has solved it." "Is that so?" Emma said, not looking up from the fence wire she was mending. "Just making an observation," James said, entirely pleased with himself. In November, word came from Abilene of a regional agricultural fair to be held in early December, an annual event that drew farmers and ranchers from 3 counties and included competitions in several categories of crop yield and quality. Emma heard about it from Miss Price, who mentioned that last year's winner in the wheat category had been a large operation from north of Abilene that had grown on premium river bottom land with an established irrigation system, and that the winning yield was the standing county record. Emma looked at her harvest records from the summer and at the soil notes she had been keeping since April, and she made a careful calculation. She went to see Hector. "The North Field yield this season," she said, spreading her notes on his kitchen table while Rosa stood in the doorway with a look that said she had known this was coming. "If we calculate it per acre against the county record, we're not that far off." Hector looked at the numbers for a long time. He looked at Emma. He looked at the numbers again. "This is your first year," he said. "I know," she said. "On land that hadn't been worked in 4 years," he said. "I know," she said. "From a standing start without an established water source," he said. "Hector," she said. "You may have broken the per acre yield record," he said. "I think I might have," she said. "I want to submit to the fair." "Then submit," he said, and Rosa, from the doorway, said "good," with the tone of a woman who had been waiting for this conclusion. Emma submitted her yield records to the Abilene Agricultural Fair Committee in late November, along with a documented account of her acreage, her methods, and the conditions of her land at the beginning of the season. The submission required a letter of verification from a witness to the harvest, and she listed Hector Vega, whose standing in the farming community was well established, and one other witness she thought might carry weight: Dr. Whitfield of the Missouri Agricultural College, who had been corresponding with her about the project and could attest to the methodology. She did not tell Noah she had submitted. She was not sure why, except that she wanted to see what happened before she said anything, and she was aware that there was a small, irrational part of her that did not want to give the old version of his expectation any room to operate. The version that had told Corbin the land would break her. She told him in December, the week before the fair. They were riding together along the northern boundary of her property in the cool December morning, a habit they had developed over the autumn months, checking the land together in the easy companionship of two people who have found that they think better when moving and prefer moving in the same direction. The horses moved in step on the dry grass, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. "I submitted to the agricultural fair," she said. He glanced at her. "In what category?" "Wheat yield per acre," she said. "That's a competitive category," he said. "The Hendersons from north of Abilene have held that record for 3 years running. Their operation is established on prime river-bottom land." "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What are you submitting?" She told him the number, the per-acre yield from her North Field's first season. He pulled his horse up short. She kept riding for 2 strides before she noticed and looked back. He was sitting very still on his gray horse, and his expression was doing something complicated that she watched with considerable interest. "Emma," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's the record," he said. "I know," she said. "By 12 bushels per acre," he said, which told her he knew the Henderson yield off the top of his head, which told her he had been paying attention to her harvest with more precision than she had realized. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a long, still moment in which she could see him reckoning with something, several things probably, and she waited without pressure for him to reach the other side of it. "I told Corbin the land would break you," he said. "You told me that you told Corbin that," she said. "Now you're going to break the record instead," he said. "I'm going to try," she said. He took off his hat. It was a gesture she had seen him make once or twice, the hat removal, and it seemed to be his version of something that other men might express with words or with dramatic demonstrations. It was quiet and it was deliberate and it was, she was coming to understand, the most sincere form of acknowledgement that Noah Ramsey possessed. He held it in front of him for a moment and then he put it back on, settling it on his head with the care of a man resettling something fundamental. "Then I'll be there," he said, "to see it." The Abilene Agricultural Fair was held on a cold, bright December morning, in a large wooden exhibition hall that smelled of dry grass and wood smoke, and the concentrated energy of several hundred people who took farming and ranching seriously enough to drive significant distances in December to talk about it. Emma arrived with Hector and Rosa, who had insisted on coming, and with Noah and James and Caroline riding alongside in their wagon. The exhibition hall was full of the specific pride and anxiety of competition, tables laden with preserved goods, grain samples, produce, livestock assessments and production records pinned to boards along the main walls. The wheat yield category had its own section near the back of the hall, where submission records were displayed with the verification documentation attached, and Emma found her own submission among them with the peculiar sensation of seeing yourself from outside yourself, everything you had done reduced to numbers on a card. The Hendersons were there, a broad-shouldered man and his 2 grown sons who worked the river-bottom operation north of Abilene, and they had the settled confidence of people who expect to win, because they always have. The older Henderson, a man named Gerald, looked at Emma's submission card when he came to review the competition, looked at it again, and then looked at Emma herself with an expression that moved through several stages before settling on reluctant respect. "First season," he said. "Yes," she said. "On the Alden parcel," he said, which told her he knew the land and its reputation. "On my parcel," she said pleasantly. He grunted. It was the grunt of a man revising a calculation. He went back to his sons and there was a low, careful discussion, and Emma turned away from it and found Noah standing beside her. "The Hendersons are looking worried," James said cheerfully from her other side. "James," Noah said, with the tone of a man addressing a person who is being useful but could stand to be less obvious about it. "Just observing," James said. The judging took most of the morning. The judges, 3 men appointed by the fair committee who were known in the community for agricultural expertise and impartiality, reviewed each submission with a thoroughness that was clearly designed to leave no room for later dispute. They asked Emma questions about her methodology, her soil conditions, her water source, the variety of wheat she had planted, and the documentation of her yield. She answered each question with the precision of someone who had been keeping detailed records all season, and she had the notes with her, organized in a leather folder she had prepared specifically for this purpose. Dr. Whitfield's letter of verification was in the folder. She had not expected this to be a point of discussion, but one of the judges read the letter twice with close attention and then said, in the tone of someone making a note, that it was unusual to have academic verification for a submission. Dr. Whitfield has been interested in the land reclamation project, Emma said. He offered to provide verification when he heard I was submitting. You know people at agricultural colleges, the judge said. I correspond with them, Emma said. I find it useful. The judge looked at her for a moment and then wrote something in his notes. At noon, the fair committee chairman announced the results from a small raised platform at the end of the hall, working through the categories with the measured ceremony of a man who enjoys this part of his job. When he reached the wheat yield category, he said the following. The record for per acre wheat yield in this county, previously held at 41 bushels per acre by the Henderson operation, has been exceeded this year by a first-year submission from Emma Alden of Harlan County, who has recorded a per-acre yield of 53 bushels from newly reclaimed hardpan land, using spring-fed irrigation and documented soil preparation methodology. The hall made a specific kind of sound that Emma had not anticipated, a collective intake followed by a murmur that ran through the room in two directions at once, the direction of people who were impressed and the direction of people who were doubtful, and then a third current that was simply curiosity moving through a room of people who paid close attention to numbers. Gerald Henderson, across the room, looked at the board and then looked at Emma and gave her a single, slow nod. His oldest son began to applaud, which started a broader round of it. Emma stood very still in the middle of it, holding her leather folder against her chest, and felt something so complete and large in her that she was not entirely sure it was containable. Noah was standing just behind her left shoulder, where he had positioned himself sometime during the judging without announcement, and she turned to look at him. He took his hat off. He held it at his side, looking at her with dark eyes that were very direct and very warm and very full of something that she recognized, because she was full of it too, and he said nothing because he did not need to. The hat was off. The message was delivered with more eloquence than most men could manage with a speech. "Put it back on," she said softly, "before you catch cold." He put it back on. His hand came to her shoulder, brief and certain, a touch that said, "I saw this. I know what this means. I knew you before the record, and I know you after it, and both are the same thing." James was considerably less restrained. He put his arm around Caroline and said, loud enough for the people nearby to hear with total clarity, "I told you so," to absolutely no one in particular and everyone in general. Rosa was crying, which she would have denied if asked, because she was not a woman who cried in public, but she was doing it anyway. On the drive back to Harlan that December afternoon, the sky going that particular pale winter gold that Emma had come to love about Texas, Noah rode alongside the wagon and they talked about the next season and the south field, and whether she would plant wheat or rotate to something else in the north field, the practical and necessary conversation of people who have land to think about. But at one point the conversation lapsed into one of those companionable silences, and he reached from his saddle to the wagon rail and his hand covered hers for a moment, warm and solid and certain, and neither of them said anything about it. She had been in Harlan County for 8 months. She had a working farm with a broken per-acre yield record, an irrigation system she had designed and built, and a second season planned with significantly better soil than she had started with. She had Hector and Rosa and James and Caroline. She had the friendship of Miss Price and the grudging respect of Gerald Henderson and the professional correspondence of Dr. Whitfield and the practical education of a single Texas season that no schoolroom could have provided. And she had, in the most significant and unplanned development of her time in Harlan, a man sitting a gray horse beside her wagon in the winter afternoon light, who had told the land office clerk that she would fail, and then spent 8 months revising everything he thought he knew. Christmas in Harlan was a small and warm affair, the community gathering in the church for a service, and then dispersing to their various homes and connections. And Emma spent it at the Ramsey Ranch at Noah's invitation, which James had seconded with enthusiasm, and Caroline had confirmed by telling Emma exactly what to bring and what time to arrive. The ranch house was larger than Emma had imagined from the outside, long and low and solid, built from the same cedar that made up most of the structures in this part of Texas, with the bookshelves along the front room wall that she had correctly envisioned, and a fireplace large enough to heat the whole space without effort. She stood in front of the books while Noah was in the kitchen discussing something with James, and she read the spines with the pleasure of someone examining a map of a mind she was becoming increasingly interested in navigating. History and philosophy, as he had said, but also natural history and several volumes on land management and a worn copy of Thoreau, and a small collection of poetry that she had not expected and that she touched the spine of gently and said nothing about. "You found the poetry," Noah said from behind her, and she turned to find him standing there with 2 cups of coffee. "Emerson and Whitman," she said. "My mother's," he said. "I kept them." She took the coffee from him and held the warm cup in both hands and looked at him in the firelight. This man who had been built by 11 years of hard land and solitary purpose into someone precise and capable, and sometimes difficult and occasionally completely surprising. And she felt the deep certainty of a feeling that had been building since April with the same patient inevitability as a good crop finding the light. "Noah," she said. "Emma," he said, and the way he said her name had always been particular. She had noticed this from very early on. He said it as if it were a specific and important word rather than simply a name, as if it carried information. "I love this land," she said. "I want to tell you that plainly so that you understand it. I am not here because I had nowhere else to go. I am here because this is where I want to be." "I know that," he said. "And I love what I'm building here," she said. "I know that too," he said. "And I love you," she said, in the same tone, the same plain directness, because she had decided on the drive back from Abilene that she was not going to wait for the right ceremonial moment for this, that Noah Ramsey would understand a plain statement of fact better than any performance of it, and that she was right. He was very still for a moment that was longer than it felt. The fire moved beside them. Outside, the December night was cold and clear and enormous. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since approximately the 2nd week of April, when you told me you had been walking the creek every morning before breakfast and then looked at me as though the answer to my question was entirely obvious." She laughed, and the laugh was as natural and involuntary as breathing. "I have not said it," he said, "because I am a man who does not say things until he is entirely certain of them, and it has taken me until now to be entirely certain that you are not going to wake up one morning and decide that Ohio was a better idea." "Noah," she said. "Yes," he said. "Ohio was never a better idea," she said. He put down his coffee cup on the mantelpiece with great deliberateness, and then he closed the space between them and kissed her, properly and without the care of first occasions, and she kissed him back in kind. And outside the Ramsey Ranch the Texas winter did its cold and brilliant work under a sky full of stars, and inside there was firelight and the smell of coffee and 2 people who had each been building toward the other for the better part of a year. The new year arrived, with the quality of things being decided. Emma spent January preparing for the 2nd season, implementing the soil improvements in the south field that the sorghum roots had made possible, designing a more permanent irrigation system to replace the spring-fed channel with something that would run from a windmill and tank she planned to have built in the spring. She corresponded with Dr. Whitfield about the plans and received back a letter that was both practically useful and in its enthusiasm, deeply gratifying. He had, he wrote, mentioned her land reclamation case in a paper presented to an agricultural conference in St. Louis, and there had been considerable interest in the methodology from other practitioners working with similar soils. "You're becoming famous in the agricultural community," Noah told her, when she read him the relevant passage from Dr. Whitfield's letter over the fence one February morning. "I'm becoming a footnote in a paper," she said. "In this county, that's famous," he said, and the near vicinity of a smile was very nearly an actual smile. February also brought the first real difficulty of the season, a dry, cold snap that came down from the north and settled over Harlan County for 3 weeks with a grip that threatened the winter crops and stressed the livestock. Emma spent the cold snap managing her animals and her stored resources with careful economy, and Noah sent Pete and Dell over twice to help with tasks that needed more hands than she and Hector had available. She did not have to ask. He sent them with practical notes about what they were good at, and a can of something Rosa had made for the animals' water to prevent freeze, which he had apparently discussed with Hector independently. This was, she thought, what it looked like when a man who showed love through action was actually in love. Not poems and speeches, though she had found the Whitman on his shelf and she understood what that said. But windmill consultations and animal care cans, and 2 hands sent over without being asked, because he had assessed her situation and acted on what he found. In March, Noah asked her to marry him. He did it at the fence line, which was, she reflected, the most appropriate possible location, standing on his side with his hands on the top post, and the morning sun making long shadows across the grass and the whole of Harlan County, stretching out behind them both in the particular beauty of early spring when everything that has been cold and brown is beginning to understand what it is going to become. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask it," she said. "I want to marry you," he said, "not because you need help or protection or any of the reasons men usually claim, because you are the person I want to build the next 40 years beside, and because this fence line between our properties is the most unnecessary structure I have ever seen and I would like to take it down." Emma looked at the fence post. She looked at him. "That may be the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me," she said. "I'm capable of romantic," he said, with the particular dignity of a man making a declaration of capability that he is aware sounds slightly defensive. "I know you are," she said. "Yes, Noah, I'll marry you." He came around the fence post because it was, indeed, unnecessary, and she stepped toward him, and they stood in the March morning with the new season beginning around them and the future so open and well-directed that it felt like exactly what it was. They were married in May, in the Harlan church. In a ceremony the minister's wife declared the finest of the year with the authority of someone who considered herself the ranking judge of such matters. Emma wore a cream-colored dress that Rosa had helped her make, simple and well-cut, with wildflowers from the property pinned at the collar. Noah wore his best dark coat and the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not entirely believe he would reach, and is now standing in it with wonder carefully moderated by his own nature into something that looked, to anyone who knew him, very much like a man entirely overwhelmed and completely happy. James stood up with Noah. Caroline stood up with Emma. Hector and Rosa sat in the front row, and Rosa cried from the beginning of the ceremony until the end, and this time she made no pretense of not doing it. The minister asked if anyone had objections, and the silence of the room was absolute and warm, filled with the specific quality of a community that has watched 2 people earn each other. After the ceremony, there was a supper at the Ramsey ranch, which was now also Emma's ranch, though they had agreed from the beginning that her parcel would remain hers in name and fact because it was the land she had built from nothing, and it was not a thing to be absorbed or dissolved into another holding. Noah had never suggested otherwise. He had, in fact, made this point before she did, because he understood what that land meant to her. They combined the operations. sharing labor and resources and planning in the practical partnership of two people who are better together than apart in precisely the ways that matter for working land. The fence between their properties came down in June, replaced by a wide gate that stood permanently open, more symbol than structure. The second season was extraordinary. The south field worked on the clay that the sorghum had broken, and the irrigation system that now ran from a windmill and tank rather than seasonal creek flow produced a wheat yield that exceeded even the north field's record-breaking first season. Dr. Whitfield received a letter in August that began with the yield numbers and proceeded for 4 pages of detailed documentation, and he wrote back immediately, calling it the most significant single-farm demonstration of hardpan reclamation he had encountered in a decade. Emma submitted to the Abilene Agricultural Fair again in December, this time with 2 categories: the North Field wheat yield in its second year, and the South Field wheat yield in its first productive year after reclamation. She won both. The per-acre record she had set the previous year with her North Field was now exceeded by her own South Field, which had produced at a rate that the fair committee chairman announced to the hall with what she recognized as genuine astonishment rather than performance. Gerald Henderson was in the hall again. He shook her hand this time without the grunt, and said that he was going to have a serious conversation with his operation about soil management practices, and that he hoped she would not mind if he wrote to ask her advice. "Write any time," she said. Noah stood behind her left shoulder again, and when she turned to him this time, he took his hat off with the same deliberate, serious ceremony as before and held it at his side, and this time she saw the full, real smile that had been in the near vicinity of appearing for almost 2 years, and it was exactly as noteworthy as she had expected. "Satisfied," she said. "Not the right word," he said. "What is the right word?" she said. He put his hat back on, and he looked at her in the crowded Abilene Fair Hall with the winter light coming through the high windows and the sounds of the agricultural community all around them, and he said, "Grateful." She reached up and straightened his hat brim, which did not need straightening, in the gesture of someone who needs to do something with their hands because feeling things requires action, and he caught her hand and held it. And James, standing nearby with Caroline, looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has been witnessing this for the better part of 2 years and considers himself personally responsible for some portion of it. The years after that were made of the particular substance of a life deliberately built, seasons layering on seasons, the land changing and deepening under their care in the way that good land responds to good attention, each year producing something more than the year before. They had a son in the autumn of 1884, born in the bedroom of what had been Emma's house, and was now their shared home on the expanded operation they ran together. They named him Thomas, after Emma's father, and he arrived in October with the particular stubbornness of a child who has opinions about timing, and he was healthy and red-faced, and possessed of a voice that James declared, upon his first meeting, was going to be audible from the south pasture. Noah held his son in the lamplight of the October bedroom, with an expression that undid every notion anyone had ever had that Noah Ramsey was not a man of deep feeling. Emma watched him from the bed, exhausted and settled and more deeply happy than she had words for, and thought of her father who had written letters about this land for 12 years without ever seeing it, and felt that he was somehow part of what had been built here in a way that transcended absence. "Thomas Alden Ramsey," Noah said quietly, looking at his son. "Do you like the name?" Emma said. "It's the right name," he said. Dr. Whitfield published his full paper on the Alden Parcel Land Reclamation Project in the spring of 1885, and this time he had checked the full name of his correspondent carefully, and the paper referred throughout to the work of Mrs. Emma Alden Ramsey of Harlan County, Texas. He sent her a copy, which she read at the kitchen table with Thomas in her lap, investigating the texture of the paper's edge. And she read the section where he described her methodology and the results and the broader implications for similar soils across the Texas grasslands, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a thing not only done but documented, not only achieved but contributed to a larger body of knowledge. She showed it to Noah that evening, and he read it with the thoroughness he brought to all reading, turning the pages steadily, and when he finished, he set it on the table and looked at her across it. "He calls you a pioneer in practical soil science," he said. "He's being generous," she said. "He's being accurate," Noah said, and picked up his coffee. Life in Harlan County expanded around them in the natural way of a community that is growing with its time and place. Miss Price's school gained a second classroom and another teacher, and Emma contributed books to the school library from a collection she began assembling from catalogs, practical and scientific volumes that she wanted available to the children growing up on this land. James and Caroline had 2 children, a boy and then a girl, and they built a new house on the eastern section of Ramsey land that James was working independently, and the 2 families were within easy riding distance, and in each other's company regularly enough that the children grew up understanding themselves to be part of a larger unit. Hector and Rosa remained essential to the operation of Emma's parcel, and when Emma suggested, in 1886, formally expanding the arrangement so that Hector held a share in the operation rather than straight wages, Noah agreed immediately, and Hector accepted after a short negotiation that ended in a handshake that Emma suspected all 3 of them would remember. Rosa declared the arrangement entirely appropriate and made a large supper to mark it. Thomas learned to walk in the spring of 1886, at 13 months, with the decisive commitment of a child who has been planning this for a while, walking straight off the porch step into the yard with no transition period. Emma caught him before he hit the dirt, and he looked up at her with an expression of absolute resolution that she recognized with great clarity, because she had seen it before on a face shaped somewhat differently. "He is exactly like you," Noah said from the porch behind her. "He's exactly like both of us," she said, which was the truth. The second child came in 1887, a daughter they named Clara, after Noah's mother, who arrived in a summer that was hot even by Texas standards, and was from the first hours of her life a person of considerable opinions and considerable charm, and who from the beginning had her father wrapped around her smallest finger in a way that Noah managed with perfect dignity, and everyone else in Harlan County found deeply entertaining. Emma watched Noah with his daughter the way she had watched him with everything that mattered to him, with the attention of someone who believes in the importance of really seeing the people you love. He was, with his children, the same thing he was with his land and his horses and his work and his wife, completely present, completely committed, and so much more tender than his surface suggested that it was still, even after years, something that moved her. "You're not what people expect you to be," she told him one evening, the children in bed, the 2 of them sitting on the porch in the warm dark with the sound of the land all around them, the crickets and the distant cattle and the windmill turning in a light wind. "What do people expect me to be?" he said. "Hard," she said. "Closed, the kind of man who only talks about the price of grain and the weather." "I talk about the price of grain constantly," he said. "You also have Whitman on your shelf," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and in the dark she could feel him considering this. "My mother used to say that the land teaches you everything if you're willing to listen," he said. She meant patience mostly, but I think she also meant that paying close attention to things is not something to be selective about. You either pay attention or you don't. You can't do it with soil and crops and weather and then shut it off when it comes to people. Emma leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, and the porch held them, and the dark held the porch, and the land held everything, rolling out in all directions under a sky that had been over this place long before either of them arrived and would be over it long after, but was, in this moment, entirely and specifically theirs. "I'm glad I came," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day." The fair in Abilene became an annual tradition for them, a marker of the seasons as reliable as harvest and planting. Emma won in her categories for 3 consecutive years before the competition from other operations that had adopted her methodology made the margin narrower, which she considered entirely satisfying, because the point had never been to hold a record indefinitely, but to demonstrate what was possible. Other farms in Harlan County and the surrounding area began implementing spring irrigation and deep-root soil preparation, and the conversations at the fair and at the general store and at the social gatherings shifted to include techniques and practices that had not been part of the common agricultural vocabulary before Emma Alden arrived on the train with a carpetbag and a deed and a particular quality of determination. She was not, she would have told you, trying to change anything. She was trying to grow wheat. But things change in the vicinity of someone who is genuinely trying to do something well, and the change spreads the way good information spreads, by being useful and true. Gerald Henderson, who had written to her as he promised, became a genuine correspondent and occasional advisor, and Emma found his perspective on large operation management valuable in ways that complemented what she and Hector had worked out on smaller scale. He visited the Ramsey operation once in 1887 and spent a full day walking the land with Emma and Hector and Noah, asking questions and taking notes, and left with a warmth toward all of them that bore no resemblance to the wary, competitive set of his jaw at that first fair. The injustices of the land out here were not invisible to Emma, and they never became so. She knew that Hector Vega had spent years working land he could not own under arrangements that were designed to keep it that way. She knew that the legal structures of Texas in 1882 and the years after created specific and deliberate disadvantages for Mexican families who had been working this earth for generations before any Anglo rancher arrived to claim it. She could not undo this. She was not powerful enough to undo it. But she could operate her own small piece of the world with a fairness that meant something to the people within it. And when Hector's son Diego came of working age in 1888, she hired him at full wages without a negotiation about whether the son of a Mexican laborer deserved the same pay as anyone else, because of course he did, and the question had never been in doubt for her. Noah held the same view. He had the particular directness of a man who evaluates people on what they can do and what they are rather than where they come from, and he had dealt with the larger injustices of the world they lived in, with a practical frustration that found its outlet in how he ran his own operation. Not enough, perhaps, in the larger accounting of things, but something. In 1889, when Thomas was 5 and Clara was 2, and the operation they ran together was as good and solid as either of them had dared to plan for, Emma received a letter from a woman in New Mexico Territory, a widow with land and the intention of farming it, who had read Dr. Whitfield's paper and written to Emma directly through the college. She was asking about irrigation and soil preparation and hardpan management, and her letter had the specific quality of someone trying to sound certain while being not entirely certain, someone who is reaching toward a thing and hoping they will not be told it is unreachable. Emma wrote back a long letter and included with it the notes she had kept from her first season, the actual working notes with their errors and revisions, not a polished account, but the real record of how the learning had happened. She wrote that the land was difficult and the work was hard, and the first year was the most expensive kind of education she had ever received, and that none of this was a reason not to do it. She wrote this because someone once had told her the land would break her, and she had not been broken, and she thought it was important to say clearly to anyone who was standing where she had stood that being told a thing is impossible is not the same as it being impossible. Thomas found this letter on the kitchen table before Emma had addressed it, and asked her who she was writing to, and she explained it to him in terms appropriate for a 5-year-old, that there was a woman far away who wanted to grow things on her land but was not sure if she could. "Can she?" Thomas said. "I think she can," Emma said. "Did you tell her that?" he said. "That is exactly what I told her," Emma said. Thomas considered this with the gravity of a 5-year-old who is processing information carefully. "Good," he said, and went back to whatever he was doing. Noah, who had been at the table for this exchange with his coffee and his catalog of seed prices, looked up from the catalog and looked at Emma with the expression she had come to know best of all, the one that was present and warm and completely real and not available to just anyone, the one she knew was hers. "Good," he agreed. By the time Texas entered the full transition of its territorial era, by the time the railroads had changed what was possible and impossible in terms of markets and supply, by the time the town of Harlan had a proper school and a proper hotel, and a newspaper that came out twice a week, Emma Alden Ramsey had been in Harlan County long enough to have watched it change around her, and to know with certainty that she had been part of that change. She had come with a deed and a carpetbag, and a determination that people had called naive, because they did not have a better word for the kind of certainty that comes from deciding rather than hoping. She had built something from hardpan and spring water and 8 months of first-season learning and 12 years of her father's letters and her own sustained, specific, unrelenting attention. She had broken a record. She had broken it twice. She had broken the assumptions of a county in the gradual and undramatic way that assumptions are actually broken, which is through the accumulation of evidence until the evidence outweighs the assumption and it simply falls away. And she had, in what she considered the least surprising and most significant thing that had happened to her in Texas, loved and been loved by a man who had stood at a fence line and told her something he believed, and then proceeded to revise everything he believed, because he was, beneath the hardpan of his own making, a man who paid attention. They were sitting on the porch one evening in the summer of 1890, a summer that was gold and dry and enormous the way Texas summers always were. Thomas asleep inside after a long day. Clara balanced on Noah's knee, pointing at things in the middle distance with the authority of a 2.5-year-old who believes she is naming the world. The land rolled out before them in the long evening light, their land. Both parcels worked together into something that was more than either had been separately, the north field showing the deep, healthy green of a good wheat year, the south field with its once hopeless clay layer now so thoroughly transformed that strangers walking it could not have guessed what it had been. "What are you thinking about?" Noah asked. "The first morning I walked out and saw the fence lines down," Emma said. "All those slumped posts. I made a list of every fence post that needed replacing." "How many was it?" he said. 47, she said. "I remember because I thought it was a significant number and I made myself say it plainly before I let myself think about anything else." "And then," he said, "and then I replaced them," she said, "one at a time." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land. Clara had found his hat brim and was engaged in a project involving it. "I am very glad," he said carefully, "that you were the kind of person who made lists and replaced fence posts rather than the kind of person who looked at 47 ruined fence posts and went back to Ohio." "I was never going back to Ohio," she said. "I know that now," he said. "I did not know it then." "What did you know then?" she said. "I knew that you were not like anything I had expected," he said. "And I knew that you walked the creek before breakfast. And I knew that your father had been right about the land in the way that some people are right about things, the kind of right that requires someone else to come along and make it actually true." Emma looked at her husband and her daughter and the land and the evening sky and felt, as she often felt in this particular configuration, that there was no richer version of this life available anywhere, that she had found it specifically here and specifically through the stubborn, joyful, difficult work of building it. "He would have liked you," she said. "My father would have liked you very much." "I think I would have liked him," Noah said. "He had good ideas about land and he raised a daughter who knew what to do with them." Clara had successfully removed Noah's hat and placed it on her own head, where it sat at an extreme angle over her small face, and she was looking up at them both from under the brim with an expression of enormous satisfaction. Emma laughed, and Noah laughed, a real full laugh that she still loved the sound of after all these years. And Clara, pleased by the response, patted the hat brim with both hands in the manner of someone who has successfully completed a project of personal importance. The stars came out above the Texas plain as the light went, one and then a dozen and then hundreds, the enormous clear sky of a land where nothing blocks your view of what is above you, and the Ramsey ranch settled into the quiet of a working place at rest, the cattle in the pasture, the horses in the corral, the children inside, the land dark and patient and generous around everything they had made. In the morning there would be work to do. There would always be work to do. The land asked that of you, and Emma had always understood the asking as a fair exchange for what it gave in return. She had come here with a deed and a dream and the specific quality of determination that does not require certainty to proceed, and she had found that the land, which everyone had told her would break her, was instead the thing that had made her, not because it was easy but because it was not, and she had met its difficulty with exactly the resources she possessed, and they had been sufficient. More than sufficient. Noah's arm was around her shoulders, warm and certain, and the hat was on Clara's head at its improbable angle, and somewhere inside the house, Thomas was dreaming whatever 5-year-olds dream, and Rosa and Hector were in their house across the yard, and James and Caroline were in the house to the east, and the town of Harlan was 6 miles down the road with its school and its church and its general store and its life moving through it in all the ordinary ways. Emma Alden Ramsey looked at all of it and tipped her own hat, figuratively, to the land she had been told would destroy her. It had not destroyed her. It had been hers. It was hers still. And the record she had broken in that Abilene hall on a cold December morning was only the most visible accounting of a thing that was really far larger and more alive than numbers could hold. The accounting of a woman who had come to wild Texas with nothing but a piece of paper and a belief that she was equal to whatever the land required. She had been right. The land had known it all along.